Saltwater Stories. The Viking Ship by J. O. Davidson. Vik, or witch, was the name given by the Norsemen of old to those deep and narrow inlets which so sharply indent the Norwegian coast, looking on the map as if old ocean had notched the rugged coastline with scars of battle and storms. 1,200 years ago, Norway's coast was peopled by a fierce and warlike race of mariners. Their own barren shores afforded few of the luxuries of life that they found among other people living within a day's sail farther south, and it is little to be wondered at that, with the strength and boldness gained by them in their hunting and fishing expeditions, they should at last find it easier to wage war upon their less marital neighbors for the plunder to which gained thereby, than to depend upon the resources of their own land for a living. As years went by and the nation continued prosperous under such conditions, their belief in the divine origin and purpose of war became fixed, and at last it became part of their religion. Even their heaven grew to be a place where warriors could fight and kill one another all day long, coming to life again at sundown, and to make merry together at night. In their youth, the Norsemen were trained to be familiar with shipbuilding, to know the ocean tides, currents, and storms, and the handling of their ships therein. They were taught to throw great spears and to avoid those thrown at them by others, to draw great bows and shoot their arrows swiftly and true to the mark, to catch on their shields those shot by their enemies. We are told that Einar Tambarskjálfur, the twanger of Thames, was powerful enough at 18 years of age to pierce with a blunt arrow a rawhide hanging loose in the wind. The villagers of those born fighters had sea rovers were built at the hands of the narrow viks, or harbors, where no enemy could attack except in front, and it was a daring foe indeed who would venture for war or retaliation into the dens of those sea-wolves. Tham was the name of his bow. Soon the dwellers in those settlements became known as Vikings, meaning almost literally inlet men, and were considered pirates. But piracy in those days was almost universal throughout the world, and the Vikings were no worse than the sea rovers of Greece, Rome, Spain, or Africa. The ships of the Vikings were marvels of strength, lightness, and speed. Their absolute length measurement has not been handed down, but the historians of those days mention crews of 120 rowers, so that with their officers and chief attendants, the crew must have numbered hundreds. Long Serpent, Short Serpent, the Dragon, were some of the names given their famous warships. Carved heads of dragons and serpents surmounted the bows and sterns. Rows of shields, painted black and yellow, were ranged along the sides. Gold and silver ornaments gleamed upon the rails and decks, and the painted sails and many-colored flags and streamers were giving them an exceedingly festive and warlike appearance as they swept in fleets through the narrow viks and tore up the dark green waters of the coast with their powerful oars. The ocean of Norway is dark green instead of blue, and the Viking ships sometimes made long voyages, for we read of King Hakon sending his daughter Christina to Spain to be married to the Spanish king. The mystery of the Viking ships is now passing away, owing to the discovery of their remains during this century. In 1867, a good-sized ship was discovered near Sharpsborg, while in 1882 there was dug out of a burial mound at Gokstad, near Christiania, the entire remains of a Viking ship, with most of their equipment in a good state of preservation. She was 87 feet long and 16.5 feet wide, and built entirely of oak. The prow and stern were richly decorated and handsomely carved. She had ports for 16 oars on a side, many of which remained in good order, as the warriors' shields also were well preserved. Among the articles found were candlesticks and copper cauldron, a sled, a fine bridle, and the anchor and stock with its long cable. There were also extra masts, the ship's water tub, and an oaken bedstead for the use of the Viking commander. The ship was evidently a burial tomb of its great captain, for the bones of his horses and dogs lay beside it, and, strangest thing of all to relate, the bones of the Viking himself, a man of giant size, 6 feet 3.5 inches tall, were found in a covered place amidships. There was nothing to show, however, whether the great chief died in battle defending his own fireside, or whether wounded in one of his own terrible forays. He had been brought home for burial, but certain it is that for 1,000 years he had lain there with his favorite war horses and hunting dogs beside his good ship, whose prow, turned towards the sea, was ready at Odin's trumpet call to launch forth once more to other deeds of valor and glory. 9 centuries ago, Leif Erikson, or Leif the Lucky, found his way, it is claimed, to the shores of America in one of the sea-skimming dragons, and skirted along our New England coast long before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. And the stone tower at Newport, the age of which no one seems to know, is thought by many to have been built by the Viking crew. Prominent Norwegians interested in the debate as to whether Ericsson really did make the voyage patriotically contributed money to have a ship built in all respects similar to the one found at Gokstad. She was sent across the ocean on a visit to America and the World's Fair in 1893 as part of Norway's exhibit. She was 77 feet long and 16 feet wide. Her rudder was on the starboard or steerboard side, and she flew the ancient and dreaded red flag and raven of the pirates of old. She had 30 oars worked by relays of rowers from a crew of 80 picked Norwegian sailors, who brought her over the sea with sails and oars just as their forefathers came so long ago amid icebergs and storms. There was one difference, however, for instead of landing on rock-bound coast inhabited by Indians, they were welcomed by a new nation, great and free, in whose harbors was many an iron warship greater and more terrible than the Vikings ever dreamt of. But these men of war did not meet to destroy one another in battle, but for the purpose of celebrating the coming of that other great sea rover and discoverer, Columbus. A Wreck and a Rescue, a True Story, by William O. Stevens. In an out-of-the-way corner of one of the huge buildings in the Naval Academy, Annapolis, hangs a boat which few visitors have ever noticed. She is an ordinary ship's gig, 26 feet long and decked out with painted canvas, on which lies a dusty placard bearing the names of her crew and telling in the fewest possible words the story of her gallant voyage. Even at that time, the incident attracted little attention, for the papers were crowded with the battles of Franco-Prussian War, and now it is only a memory among the older officers of the Navy, but it is too fine a story to be forgotten. By the 29th of October, 1870, the USS Saginaw had finished dredging a channel from the Pacific mail steamers at Midway Island, and following his instructions, for Commander Captain Sicard sailed that afternoon to take a look at the ocean island about 60 miles distant. During the night, the Saginaw was caught by a strong ocean current, and about 3 o'clock the following morning crashed upon a coral reef. As an officer and man rushed on deck, many were hurled back by the torrents of water that poured down the hatchways. On gaining the deck, they found great seas breaking over the ship, which drove everyone to a place of safety in the rigging. To a few minutes the vessel was forced so high on the rocks that the seas were less dangerous, and it was possible to do something for the safety of the crew. It was a time to try the coolest nerves. No one knew where they were, for the darkness made it impossible to see beyond the side of the ship, which was rapidly pounding to pieces. All the boats on one side were smashed when the smokestack toppled over the side, followed by the mainmast, which was chopped away. About daybreak, or 6 o'clock, the forward half of the ship broke away and swung in further upon the reef. But the dawn revealed within the reef a small island, Ocean Island itself. At the sight of the land the men cheered, and worked with a will to get the undamaged boats afloat over the breakers to the shore. All that day was spent in saving as much of the provisions as possible, amounting to a couple of barrels of pork and a small quantity of canned vegetables and coffee. Fortunately, the carpenter's chest was also saved, along with hammocks of the men, which were used as tents. On looking about, they found that the Ocean Island was a low sand spit, nowhere more than 14 feet above the level of the sea and covered with bushes. As there was no spring to be found, a dozen wells were dug, but in every case the water proved to be too blackish, and it looked as if the 70 officers and men had escaped drowning only to die miserably of thirst. When, at the suggestion of some ingenious fellow, a condenser was rigged by means of the ship's boiler and a rubber hose, which supplied 40 or 50 gallons a day. Luckily, fuel was provided by the wreck of an old whaler embedded in the sand. Naturally, this could not supply fuel indefinitely, and the amount of food saved from the ship was barely enough to supply officers and men for a month at 1/4 rations. That is, 1/4 of their regular daily allowance. This was helped out by seal meat and fish, but both proved unwholesome. Since Ocean Island was so far out of the track of ships, it was only too clear that starvation was bound to come in time unless help could be brought from somewhere. Accordingly, Captain Sicard decided to fit out one of the small boats that escaped the wreck and let a volunteer crew try to take her to the Hawaiian Islands, 1,200 miles distant, to get relief. Out of the volunteer officers, the men who instantly pressed forward, Lieutenant J.G. Talbot and 4 seamen, were selected to undertake the long and perilous journey. The boat was fitted out with all the care possible under the conditions, containing a few necessary instruments, 25 days' provision, 90 gallons of water, and 3 weeks after the wreck of the Saginaw, the little gig spread sail and disappeared below the horizon, followed by anxious eyes. Meanwhile, Captain Sicard had begun work on a larger boat to be built of the material in the wreck of the Saginaw, for the double purpose of gaining another chance of rescue and keeping the men occupied. It was very difficult work, and the officers and men toiled together manfully, but owing to the wretched food, fully 1/3 of the number were always on the sick list. Finally, at the end of the 2nd month, it began to look as if the little boat had been lost, and the remaining chances of escape were small indeed. But about 4 in the afternoon of January 3rd, 1871, the lookout perched on the top of the signal mast shouted, "A steamer's smoke!" and a great cry of joy went up from the camp. The little gig had succeeded after all. The strange vessel proved to be a Hawaiian steamer dispatched to their relief. And it brought also the melancholy story of what the mission of rescue had cost their brave comrades. Scarcely had the gig been 5 days at sea when all fire was lost, with absolutely no means of getting any, so that for 3 miserable weeks there was not a spark for cooking or drying. As the heavy seas flooded the little craft, the canvas decking proved leaky, and in a few days there was not a dry square inch in the boat. Such food as was not ruined had to be eaten raw and soggy with salt water, and as a result, Lieutenant Talbot and 2 of the crew were sick for weeks together. Meanwhile, the farther they went, the worse grew the weather. Twice the boat had to heave to with a sea anchor to avoid being swamped twice, and drag broke adrift. The third hung for 3 hours and then was swept away, but fortunately the boat rode out the remainder of the gale safely. 3 such gales were weathered. Day after day and week after week went by of drenching waves, of cold fatigue, sickness, and starvation, till finally, after a voyage of 38 days over a course of 1,600 miles, the adventurers sighted a blue pinnacle of rock, which meant the outpost of the Hawaiian Islands. Even then the weather continued so rough that the boat had to be kept away for 3 days, waiting for a favorable opportunity to enter the harbor. Early on the morning of December 19th, while waiting for daylight to show the channel, the gig was sucked in by the current and capsized, reportedly in the tremendous breakers. In their emaciated condition, the men could not struggle long, and of the 5, only one, William Halford, the sturdy coxswain of the gig, staggered ashore alive, bearing in his arms one of his comrades, who was already past rescuing. It was Halford who carried the news that dispatched relief to the ocean island. Fortunately, neither at the time of the wreck of the Saginaw nor during the 68 days of imprisonment on the island was there any loss of life, save that of the Lieutenant Talbot and the 3 men who gave theirs in effort to save their shipmates. A tablet, subscribed to by the officers of the Saginaw, has stood for years in the Naval Academy Chapel as a quiet reminder of their heroism to the younger generation of officers, who also may be called on for self-sacrifice in the line of duty at any moment of their careers. The inscription concludes with these fitting words: "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends."